My name is Eugene Slabbert, and I am a second-year master's student at Nelson Mandela University. Welcome to my presentation of Towards a Risk Assessment Matrix for Information Security Workarounds. Within the presentation today, I'll be covering the following topics found in this presentation roadmap: information security policies and procedures, workaround discussion, Alter's definition of workarounds, Alter's theory of workarounds, protection motivation theory, the employee decision-making process, information security risk management, information security workaround risk assessment matrix, workaround risk assessment process, and the conclusion. Information security policy and procedures. To understand where information security policies fall within an organization, I would like to bring to your attention the corporate governance direct control cycle. The direct control cycle includes the three levels of an organization, namely the board of directors and executive management, senior and middle management, and lower management and administration. In the direct position of the cycle, the board of directors issues directives that dictate the direction that the organization should move in. Senior management handles the tactical implementation of the directives from the board of directors. These documents are expanded versions for the high-level directives in the form of specified policies, standards, and detailed procedures. These more detailed policies, standards, and procedures are then taken down to the operational level for implementation. Policies are designed to guide employees in their decision-making process within the job position to match the expectations of their organization. Standards dictate the expectations of compliance, and procedures describe the step-by-step process required to fulfill the expectations of standards and organizational policies. Further added are the technical measures to implement these documents and measure the levels of compliance to them. The final output of this operational level administrative documents during the execution phase. The control portion of the cycle starts at the operational level, where measured data is collected from multiple sources and entities, electronic or manual. This data is passed into the tactical level, where upper management compiles the collected data and measures it against the organization's standards. That information is then compiled into executive management reports that indicate compliance level when compared to the organizational standards. These reports are forwarded to the board of directors, who strategically review the employee's compliance compared to the original directives. Alter's definition of workarounds. There are many existing definitions for a workaround. Alter's definition is used as his work is well defined and supported, forming the backbone of a lot of modern research relating to workarounds. The definition states that a workaround is a goal-driven adaptation, improvisation, or other change to one or more aspects of an existing work system in order to overcome, bypass, or minimize the impact of obstacles, exceptions, anomalies, mishaps, established processes, management expectations, or structural constraints that are perceived as preventing that work system or its participants from achieving a desired level of efficiency, effectiveness, or other organizational or personal goals. When presented with a perceived obstruction or inefficiency, an employee's deviation from procedures can only be considered a workaround when the modification or procedure is performed that deviates from the recommended procedure's intention when the employee has a specific goal that they wish to accomplish. Workarounds. Information security is a major concern for modern organizations. Nearly all organizations rely on vast numbers of technologies and risk treatment methods. However, human behavior and decision-making factor of information security in the form of non-compliance or resistance remains the weakest link in the chain. One of these forms of non-compliance or resistance are workarounds. Workarounds exist everywhere and have the potential to introduce information security risk nearly every time that they're utilized. Information security workarounds in particular also increase risk within an organization as their utilization circumvents implemented policies and procedures. Employees cannot be trusted to utilize their own homegrown work procedures as they may not account for information security concerns. Information security workarounds therefore need to have their risk assessed to decide what plans of action need to be taken about them. Alter's theory of workarounds. Workarounds generally do not occur without reason, but rather than as an event in a series of steps accounting for people and the environments they're utilized in. Alter aims to explain this process behind the utilization of workarounds, and even though other theories may exist, this is the chosen one. Alta's theory of workarounds occurs in a seven-step process. The first two steps are used to form the content of the context of the workaround environment, assisting with understanding the why and how. The remaining 5 steps relate to the workaround itself occurring. Step 1, the intentions, goals, and interest. This step considers the intentions, goals, and interest of management. Understanding the goals of management is important for policy designers to create the policies employees are expected to comply with and the procedures that they need to follow. Step 2, structure. The structure of policies, procedures, and standards, how they are designed, and the performance goals and reward systems used all influence the behavior of those expected to comply with the policies and procedures. Step 3, perceived need for the workaround. This step is based on the performance goals of procedures, system structure constraints, as well as the employee goals. This need for the workaround can come from a perceived obstruction that the employee encounters when trying to achieve their goal. Identification of possible workarounds. This is triggered by the perceived need for a workaround. Employees consider the costs, benefits, and risks when obstacles are encountered, and they perceive a need for the workaround. During this stage, the employee could choose to follow through with the work or go back through with a workaround or back out if the risk is perceived to be too high. Step 5, the selection of workarounds to pursue, if any. In this step, employees decide on the most appropriate workaround, if any, to utilize and overcome the perceived obstacle in their workflow. Step 6, development and execution of the workaround. This step can occur over a short to long period of time, depending on the complexity of the situation presented to the employee. The employee will tailor a workaround to suit their specific needs, such as if they value efficiency or ease of use. Step 7, local consequences and broader consequences. A workaround may yield local and broader consequences in its utilization. These consequences may either be positive or negative, depending on the risk introduced by the workaround. Positive consequences being efficiency gains as an example, and a negative being organizational risk. Employee decision to implement workarounds. At steps 3 and 4 of Alta's theory of workarounds, an employee needs to decide if a workaround is needed or if that workaround should be implemented. The employee's decision could be based around the outcome of the application of protection motivation theory. The protection motivation theory. Although many theories aiming to understand human decision-making exists, the protection motivation theory has been chosen as it relies on a person's threat appraisal and coping appraisal. This could provide an explanation for an employee's decision to use a workaround in a specific environment. Threat appraisal consists of perceived vulnerability and perceived severity. Perceived vulnerability is an employee's perception of the validity of threats that they may encounter. Perceived severity is the perception of the consequences of the perceived threats being realized. Coping appraisal consists of self-efficacy, response cost, and response efficacy. Self-efficacy is described as an employee's drive to implement procedures that would keep them safe and their belief in their ability to execute those procedures. Habits and personal biases towards activities, for example, may influence an employee's perception of their self-efficacy. Response cost. Response cost is the cost that an employee perceives from the implementation of a prescribed procedure, which may include related consequences for their non-compliance. Lastly, response efficacy relates to the employee's perception of how effective a procedure might be in their work environment. The employee decision-making process simplified. Presented here is the employee decision-making process shown in a simplified manner. Work as imagined represents management's behavioral and work output expectations within an organization. This is represented as policies, procedures, and standards that are disseminated to the employees. These documents are distributed with the expectation of employee compliance. In an ideal world, the employee would continue their work and the work output would be the exact or as close to management's expected output as possible. The employee decision-making process simplified continued. In this next version, however, after work is imagined, the employee may encounter a constraint or obstruction to their workflow. The constraint or obstruction to their workflow is the proxy for the environmental elements or employee disobedience for the use in this presentation. The employee may either continue to work as done, the expected way, or choose to implement a workaround. The workaround stage represents the identification of possible workarounds. Selection of workarounds to pursue then provides an opportunity to not implement that workaround if it's unsatisfactory for information security concerns, if there are any. With an employee choosing to utilize a workaround, they'll continue to the work as done, but this time in an unexpected manner with an unexpected outcome. However, in this example, the expected outcome is reached by using an unexpected process. The employee decision-making process. A hypothetical example is provided using Hospital X, a hypothetical hospital where a formal information security policy has been implemented and sufficiently supported. A workaround is performed daily in this reception area of Hospital X, and employees interact with information assets in the form of employee records and patient information. The information security policy specifies that employees should log out of their account when they're no longer at their computer. The workaround in this example allows for employees to remain logged in even when they're not there, as discussed in more detail as follows. Using Alty's theories of workarounds as a guide, this decision-making process as to why an employee at Hospital X may perceive a workaround as necessary can be understood. Step 1 simply aims to add organizational context. The employees expect to conform with the information security policy of Hospital X, represented as an acceptable use policy. Step 2 indicates that the work procedure within the AUP that states that employees should log out of their work account when not at their workstation as an information security best practice. In Hospital X, a backup automated logout system is implemented to log employees out after 10 idle minutes on their workstation. An employee may perceive that there is an obstruction to getting their work done at this step. In this case, logging out and then having to log back into their workstation is perceived by the employee to take up a lot of time and may be viewed as tedious by the employees. For employees who do not perceive this requirement as being tedious, their work continues as normal and the employee logs in and out as required. This is management's expected work output. In this sub-example, the management's expected work output is that the employee continues to work, implementing the expected procedures. However, if employees choose to circumvent the obstruction using a workaround, step 4 occurs. Step 4 occurs when an employee finds the logging out to be a tedious or counterproductive to their workflow and seeks an alternative. The protection motivation theory can be used to theorize the outcome of their decision. In this example, the threat appraisal of employees considered the vulnerability of an unlocked computer as low, as well as low severity if there has to be some type of associated breach. With regards to coping appraisal, an employee may be confident in their self-efficacy for relogging onto their work account, even though they may see more benefit in not complying. The response cost of not complying with the procedure may be high as consequences are outlined in the AUP, but the employee either may not be aware of the IP and its contents or may regard the workaround as more beneficial to them than following the correct procedure. Lastly, considering response efficacy, the employee does not feel that logging out their account may result in a significant information security risk reduction than they could possibly gain back when it comes to treating patients. In this example, the employee ultimately chooses to use the identified workaround. Step 5 occurs when the workaround is chosen and the employee decides that defeating the automated logout system will be most effective. The employee does not log out of their workstation as this introduces too much delay into their work. Step 6 is the actual utilization of the workaround. The employee asks a coworker to tap on their computer's spacebar before the 10-minute automated logout has occurred, which keeps them logged in for longer periods of time. The computers, while logged in, may be left unattended for a period. Step 7. The risk in this example is leaving a logged-in computer unattended, which may give unauthorized access to patient information to somebody who should not have access if that correct procedure was followed. Employees' modified work output occurs when the employee has completed their work and logs out at the end of the day. The employer has gotten their job done, but has used a workaround of information security procedures to achieve that goal. Information security risk management. Risk assessment is done by identifying all important assets within an organization and determining what those assets are vulnerable to and the frequency at which a threat may try to exploit that vulnerability. A threat is an entity or natural occurrence, either internal or external to the organization, that aims to take advantage of vulnerabilities that assets have. The vulnerability of an asset describes how likely an asset is to resist an attack from a threat. Assets are anything the organization deems to be valuable to their operation. These assets are identified by the asset owner during the risk management process. An asset's impact value is determined by the importance of the asset to the organization and the consequences of that asset's loss. Asset impact value considers public reaction to a data breach, cost of fines and loss of an asset's value that are brought to the organization. Asset's impact value is not an exact value, but rather an organizationally relative value. An example of risk assessment method can be found in ISO 27005. Risk assessment is a three-part process containing the identification, analysis, and evaluation of risks. Risk identification requires the identification of all assets, threats, and vulnerabilities associated with those assets. Risk analysis determines the probability of those risks occurring on a day-to-day basis, and risk evaluation determines how severe those risks are to an organization's operations. Following risk assessment, various actions could be taken to treat that risk. Risk treatment can be used to identify Following risk assessment, various actions could be chosen in risk treatment to address the risks identified. These actions are risk modification, risk retention, risk avoidance, risk sharing, and risk acceptance. Risk modification considers the financial, time, and operational constraints of an organization when implementing controls to reduce the risk to an asset or group of assets. Risk retention is the acceptance of that risk in its form if the organization's operational goals allow for the risk to exist without affecting the organization negatively. Risk avoidance is the process of modifying processes, procedures, or activities to avoid specific risk that could not be financially viable nor efficient to manage reasonably. Risk sharing takes place by splitting risk between two parties, sharing those consequences between them, such as insurance coverage on assets. Risk acceptance is when the identified risk is accepted by the organization. Accepting the risk may prove to be beneficial, as the risk may allow the organization to achieve benefits such as efficiency, and it might not be a simple priority to treat the risk. After risk treatment, there's always going to be residual risk, which is a remaining risk after the actions performed have been implemented. Residual risk is accepted and monitored in subsequent rounds of risk assessment in the case of priority of these risks changing. Information security workaround risk assessment matrix. For information security workarounds risk to be assessed, workarounds need to be identified by management. Examples of ways in which workarounds could be identified are observation, surveys, and reports of breaches. Workarounds can be assessed using the information security workaround risk matrix based on the risk assessment matrix in ISO 27005. I present the risk assessment matrix for information security workarounds. Frequency of workaround utilization is the rate at which workarounds are implemented, low being once off, medium being occasionally, and if part of a daily routine, the frequency is high. The perceived workaround vulnerability is determined by accounting for the vulnerability of an asset using the level of security considered when implementing the workaround. Asset impact value is determined by considering the intangible relative impact cost of a threat being realized. When using the risk assessment matrix for information security workarounds to assess the risk of a workaround used in Hospital X, the frequency of workaround utilization, the workaround vulnerability, as well as the asset impact value must be determined by information security officers. In the workaround identified in Hospital X example, the frequency of workaround utilization is high, as the workaround is used in the day-to-day operations. The perceived workaround vulnerability in the example is determined to be medium. While there may be technical measures in place to protect the patient's information, the computers in question are in the reception area of the hospital and are easily accessible to the public. If no employees are present in the reception area and the computers are left logged in, nobody would be aware of unauthorized access, as security cameras are not monitored live. The asset impact value in the example is determined to be very high, as information assets are patient records. Therefore, in Hospital X's example, the result from the risk assessment matrix for information security workarounds is 7. Workaround risk value. Using the proposed risk assessment matrix for information security workarounds and the workaround risk index, the risk associated with identified workarounds can be identified and appropriate action taken. Medium to high risk workarounds should be explicitly identified in information security policies and procedures as unacceptable behavior, and the resultant consequences detailed. Low risk workarounds should be considered for incorporation into information security policies and procedures by adapting the relevant processes to reflect the way employees are working. Once a resultant value has been calculated through the risk assessment matrix, it can then be referred to the information security workaround risk index. To determine the final risk level, in Hospital X's example, the calculated value from the risk assessment matrix is 7. Therefore, the information security risk index for workaround example is determined to be high. The risk assessment matrix for information security workarounds can play an important role in identifying the risk exposure that a workaround may face that may introduce into an organization. An employee's decision-making process to utilize workarounds accounting for the risk assessment process. The employee's decision-making process returns here. However, using what has been presented earlier, workarounds need to be captured, and to show where the workarounds are captured and how the information is used, a modified version of this figure is created. In this new version, workarounds are captured at the 7th step in the place of the employee's modified work output, and they have their risk assessment applied to them. The information from the risk assessment is then fed back into the work as imagined, where the information can be reviewed by the board of directors and upper management. The information gained can then be used to decide if a workaround with low enough risk value is presented. It could create a more efficient procedure. However, a medium to high risk workaround may be useful to capture in order to set up a system catch to monitor its usage and mitigate its usage or present itself as an unacceptable use case in an acceptable use policy. The conclusion. Information security policies and procedures exist to mitigate information security risk through controlling the behavior of employees. Non-compliance with these policies and procedures opens an organization back up to the risks that they sought to mitigate, and one of those forms of non-compliance being workarounds. Using Alta's theory of workarounds containing a multi-step process that can be used to understand the different steps that occur from management's intentions to an employee's decision to implement a workaround. Further, following through to the expected or unexpected work outcomes through the utilization of workarounds and the inherent risk exposure that follows. This presentation proposes the objective risk assessment matrix for information security workarounds by assigning a frequency of workaround utilization, perceived workaround vulnerability, and asset impact value to an identified workaround. Risk assessment using the proposed risk assessment matrix for information security workarounds allows for the understanding of risk exposure of a workaround. The information security risk index then allows for the associated risk value to be determined by comparing the risk assessment matrix for information security workarounds output to the information security workaround risk index. Oh, I was one off. Okay, that was, oops.